So this year has been a thing that is happening. A whole lot of things and events and things have been happening. So I decided to watch these two movies that I feel really sum up this year weirdly well. These movies are Steven Soderbergh's Contagion and Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Two movies that might be more relevant now than they ever were actually, as we are about to see. So I'm gonna start with the movie Contagion. This movie came out in 2011 and it's a movie that definitely got a lot more attention in recent times for obvious reasons, as this movie has a more realistic approach to this type of story, as in, the story of a virus. There are no zombies here, no supervillain plots. It's just a virus that spreads fast and how the world deals with that. The movie is at its best when it's showing you how the virus spreads in sometimes subtle ways and sometimes not so subtle ways. There are these scenes with no dialogue, just video that shows close-ups of hands and food, human contact, and while we cannot see the virus, these images do a really good job of conveying the idea of it spreading. And besides, it has a plot significance, as it slowly reveals the source of the virus. I also really liked how the virus would affect major characters. It added to the idea that this was a real virus and that the main characters, putting themselves in situations of risk, don't have some form of infamous plot armor. In a lot of ways, I felt like this was a War of the Worlds type movie with a more realistic template. Sorry if I'm using the word realistic a lot. Now, this is what I liked of this movie. Everything else though, I thought it was competent, but I didn't love it. For example, I don't know why, but this movie has that urine yellow lighting that was very common around the late 2000s, but in this movie it really didn't bother me, as it kind of did give a movie like a more sick feeling, which makes sense if you know what I mean. Now, something that actually really bothered me a bit more was how some of the choices the movie makes go against the idea of the realism for the sake of it being a big Hollywood movie. First, I want to talk about Matt Damon's acting. While I don't think his performance is bad, I felt that someone else more emotive would have fit in this role better. His character goes through quite a lot of shocking things right at the beginning of the movie, and it doesn't seem that affected by them. And this happens quite a lot in the movie. Quite intense scenes fall flat on the emotional side. This could also be a problem with how the movie is directed, as, like I said, goes for a more realistic and clinical take. And in search of that, they made scenes that should have been emotional but end up being rather tone deaf. Now, this other factor is one that I think is a lot more to do with what I said previously about it being a Hollywood movie. There are these scenes that were supposed to show how the virus brings people to desperation, but they end up feeling like very movie-like, if you know what I mean, especially around riots and robbery scenes. A specific plot thread that felt very Hollywood was the character of Marion Cotillard. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. There are scenes where her character is kidnapped, and I do understand that maybe this feeling that these things are kind of over exaggerated and unrealistic might come from the idea that I'm in the middle of an actual pandemic right now. And it's also important to understand that the virus in this movie is a lot deadlier and contagious than the one in real life at this moment. Next we have Jude Law's character. He was weird. He was supposed to represent the conspiracy theory crowd, but in a more positive way. kind of like he's actually trying to find a cure that serves more as an opposition to the rest of the movie, as every character beside him is a very serious and almost monotone. And he is more of a loudmouth journalist. His character works because of this contrast, but he also feels very isolated, as we never see people on his side, despite being told there is quite a lot of people who also have that friend of mine. Another reason I wish there was more characters like Jude Law, and this is more on a personal note, is one, because honestly it makes the movie more entertaining. For a lot of this movie is talking and a lot of science and political talk. And if you're into that, all the power to you, but I personally find that stuff to be a bit on the boring side. And two, because his character can feel like a catch-all for those type of people. It would have been cool to see people who maybe are more radical or maybe even religious groups and see how they deal with the virus and this situation. And that's about it for everything else in this movie. I guess everything was okay. Matt Damon's story was okay, Kate Winslet's story was okay, Lawrence Fishburne's story was okay, and it's cool that they're all interconnected, but individually I just felt like they didn't have enough of an emotional punch. But of course this could vary on the viewer and your experience watching this movie. As I said before, the whole political and the scientific angle don't really engage me as much as maybe the emotional side would. That being said, I still think this is a movie you should watch, especially in the moment that we exist right now, 2020, and there is definitely an educative angle to this movie. Makes me think that maybe kids in middle school and high school will be watching this in biology classes for the next few years. Overall, I give it a 7 out of 10, and I think it's a good movie. It's a well-built movie with quite a few flaws, but still a worthy one to watch, like I said, especially in our times. Now, the other movie we have here is Do the Right Thing. This one definitely touches on a bit more of a touchy subject, and I'll be trying to talk about it in a responsible and fair manner. First, I want to say that I really enjoyed this movie. That's the reason why I picked it for this duo over other movies that might be more about actual social movements. As far as Spike Lee movies goes, this might not even be the most direct or overt movie about this topic. But let me explain. There's a nice tone to this movie as it takes place over a single day in a majority black neighborhood, and we see how these fairly normal people live their lives on a very hot summer day. Even though sometimes they may act in a more comical way, which I think was done to give this movie a somewhat light-hearted tone, so it isn't as hard to swallow when it does throw harder themes at you. The overall plot centers around Sal's Pizzeria, a pizzeria owned by an Italian American called, well, Sal, which is funny because it kinda sounds like salt in Italian. This is where our main character Mookie, played by Spike Lee himself, works for that day. Sal, he is not an outright racist character, unlike his son. He has worked in this neighborhood for 25 years, and seeing those kids, now adults, grow on his food is something that makes him proud. I believe that the point being made here is that a lot of people's hatreds towards a certain group of people may come from a lack of exposure and knowledge about a certain culture, and Sal, having spent 25 years in that neighborhood, learned to love these people that are different and not so different from him. Unlike his son, Pino, his other son is alright, who is still young and is pushed by his friends to dislike black people, and he feels shame in having to work in a place to accommodate them. Despite liking and looking up to black artists, he doesn't even see them as black, highlighting his segregated racism. but Sal is very proud of his Italian heritage, which creates the major conflict of the movie, with the character bugging out over pictures on the wall being only of whites, specifically Italian Americans. Being that bugging out, the other character creating the conflict, would like more representation on that wall. As the movie progresses, Sal creates more animosity with a couple of other black characters, usually due to a lack of communication. A lot of people like to bring up the both sides argument, but never have I watched a movie that was this fair in showing all sides, as we see everyone's lives throughout this very specific day, and it shows how this movie reaches its very violent conclusion, while still being very poignant in the themes of police brutality and misunderstanding of issues between cultures. And that's why I picked this movie specifically for this duel. I feel like it's a slice, an event in time. While fictional, it feels like something that could actually happen, and represents something that actually happens on a daily basis. Most of my gripes with this movie actually come from technical ones. The pacing, while intentional, can feel a bit slow at times, and the acting can be a bit hit or miss in some spots, especially for slightly minor characters. I say slightly minor characters because it's hard to define that, as a lot of the characters are really just supposed to be people that are living here rather than being some kind of important character in a big plot. And my biggest issue is actually how they represent Latino and Asian characters in this movie. They can feel rather stereotyped, and I feel like in a movie like this, that's a bigger problem. Like, Latinos' character traits was that they liked Latino music, and the Koreans' character trait was that they didn't know how to speak English and were stingy with money. But regardless of that, I still think that the overall message of this movie is really well done. I very much kept from going into detail of the final showdown, so to say, of this movie, as that I do think it's probably the most important part, and I'd rather not spoil it for you, as I do think you should experience it for yourself. And yes, no matter your race, I guess I should say that. And my rating for this movie is an 8 out of 10. So that's it. These were the two movies I felt like best described 2020 so far. We're here in July, and yeah, I don't know what else could happen. Maybe there'll be a sequel to this if something crazy happens. Hopefully not. Hopefully we don't get hit by a meteorite. Anyways, I think it's important for me to say, please keep this course in the comments cordial. Given the size of my channel, if you write something, I will read it, so feel free to tell me if you feel I misrepresented something or if you think I could have done something better. So please feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, I think, hopefully, in 2020.